Hello, my name is Carley Bell, and I am a sophomore biology major here at Oglethorpe. I'm taking bioseminar this semester, and I'm doing my bioseminar presentation on the effects of climate change on trout populations. I chose this topic because I know that climate change affects species of all levels, all the way down to the smallest of bacteria and all the way up to humans. And so I wanted to study more in depth of just how and why climate change affects species the way that it does. And so I chose trout as my model organism because I also really like fish. And I thought it would be really interesting to study what it is about fish that makes climate change affect it the way that it does, and just how climate change does affect it. So let's get into it. So the first thing I want to do is go over an outline. There's going to be 6 main things in my presentation that I want to accomplish. And the first is to go over some background information to just define trout, define climate change, and talk about the specific characteristics that are going to be important to the presentation. And then I want to go into the major questions of the researchers that have studied this and made research papers about it that I have particularly studied for this presentation, and then the hypothesis of the researchers. After that, I want to just take a minute and talk about why it matters on a larger scale than just trout, because this is a fairly long presentation. And so I want to talk about why it matters on different scales. And I know I kind of touched on it for a second on why I chose the topic. I said that I feel like it affects species of all levels, but I really want to dive into how it affects them and why we should care about it, because I feel like that's the most important part of this. And then next, I'm going to go into detail about 2 specific research studies that have studied the effects of climate change on trout in different places of the United States. And then lastly, I'm going to go through a take-home message, which is just 3 main points that I hope you all take away from this presentation and add to your general arsenal of knowledge about climate change. So first, climate change, what this whole topic is about. So what climate change is just a change in the average conditions of temperature and precipitation in a region over a period of time. Climate change, it can look like many different things. Just in this picture alone, we have 4 different scenarios, all caused by climate change. So the first is an increase in temperature. The second is drought. The third is heavy precipitation and rainfall. And the last is forest fires. Those are very different scenarios, but all are caused by climate change. So like I said, it can look like many different things. But the main thing to understand is just that overall, it is a change in the average conditions. So in the studies that we're going to talk about today, they specifically study trout in the United States. So I want to just give a little background about how climate change has affected the United States. So first, we have this graph on the left that talks about the change in precipitation in the United States over time. So on the x-axis, we have year, 1910 to 2020 is what this graph goes from. And then on the y-axis, we have percent of land area. And this is showing the precipitation in the United States over time. And these gray bars are showing the precipitation, but the orange, I like how they added the orange lines because it allows you to see kind of the common trend over time. And as shown by this graph, precipitation has increased in the United States from 1910 to 2020, and it specifically peaked around the 2000s. Next, over here on the right, we have the temperature in the United States over time. And this graph goes from 1900 to 2020. So this graph actually has 10 more years on it. It goes back a little bit further. And on the y-axis, it has temperature in degrees Fahrenheit. So the 2 things we want to focus on in this graph is the orange bars and the blue bars. So first, we're going to talk about the orange bars. The orange and blue bars are both Earth's surface, but the orange bars is the actual land and air. And so this graph shows that the temperature of the land and air in the United States has increased over time. And then the blue bars is the water temperature in the United States over time. So although the water temperature has consistently stayed under 0 degrees Fahrenheit on average, it has increased over time still. And as you can see in the later, like in the 2000s, you can't even really see the bar, which means it's probably pushing 0 or the positive numbers. Whereas in the 1900s, it almost reached -2 degrees Celsius. And these graphs were found from the Environmental Protection Agency based on weather data from the United States. So these graphs are accurate, and it shows that the general theme of climate change in the United States is that precipitation and temperature has increased over time due to climate change. Now we're going to get into trout. All right, so trout are cold water species, meaning that they thrive in cold water environments and they need cold water to survive. So trout are what you call ectothermic. And what that means is that the temperature around them in their environment is what their body temperature is going to be. So humans, like for example, I can be in a really cold place and still maintain a warm body temperature, but trout cannot do that due to them being ectothermic. So if the water temperature around trout is warm, trout are going to be warm. If the water temperature is cold, trout are going to be cold. So trout are very dependent on the environment around them as far as temperature goes. And they have what is called a critical thermal maxima, which means the highest possible temperature that they can survive in before they lose motor control and ultimately die. And there's many different species of trout. And so obviously the different species are going to have slightly different characteristics. They're going to vary in what exactly they need to survive and what particular environments they thrive in. So each trout species is going to have a slightly different critical thermal maxima, but it is usually never higher than approximately 25 degrees Celsius. So all trout are cold water species. And if they are in an environment that exceeds their critical thermal maxima, they will die. And that's why they are particularly vulnerable to climate change that warms their water temperature, because they can't survive if it warms it too much. Now we're going to talk about trout's reproduction status. So their reproductive traits is a male and a female that release their egg and sperm at the same time. But after the egg and sperm is released, it's kind of on its own. There's actually no parental care of the eggs. So what happens is the egg and the sperm are released, and then the female trout usually covers the eggs with gravel to kind of keep them grounded in the water, and then allows the sperm to travel through the water to reach the eggs and then fertilize them to reproduce. However, this also makes trout particularly vulnerable to climate change, because climate change increases temperature and precipitation. And so the temperature increase will affect them because they're cold water species. But the precipitation, as we saw in those graphs, precipitation has increased in the United States over time. And the effect that that can have on streams is that it can increase flow regime, making flow harder and faster. And when that happens, it can wash away these eggs. As you can see in these pictures, they are around this gravel that the mother trout has put them in, but there's no egg. I mean, there's no fish that can be seen around the eggs in these pictures. So there's no parental care. So if the flow regime is too harsh, it can just wash the eggs right away and they won't be able to reproduce. So that's why trout cannot survive in stream reaches that have harsh flow regimes, because there's no way for them to reproduce. So now, after we have the background, we know what trout is and we know the characteristics that they have and we know what climate change is. How exactly does climate change affect the occurrence of trout and the availability of trout habitat? That's what we're going to get into. And all that means, the occurrence of trout, the only thing that means is the presence of trout in a specific area that is suitable for them. And the availability of trout habitat is just a habitat that is suitable for them. So this is the exact same thing. It's just kind of two different ways of saying it. The occurrence of trout is just specifically referring to the trout itself, while the availability of habitat is referring to the land around it and the stream reaches that are actually suitable for them, but they will directly relate. If a stream reach is suitable for trout, then they will have that amount of availability of trout habitat and their occurrence will be there. Now, the next question is, you may be familiar with the idea that climate change negatively affects different species, but how do we know that? What data actually tells us that climate change is bad for us or bad for trout? And so we're going to get into all of that in this study. The hypothesis of the researchers from all of the studies that I've read all have the same hypothesis, that as climate change increases, the availability of trout habitat and thus the occurrence of trout will decrease. And this is because as climate change increases, stream temperature and stream flow will increase. So they think that these things that increase as climate change increases will decrease trout and trout habitat. And so here's just a little figure of increase in temperature plus higher flow regime equals less trout. So why does this matter? I feel like these next two slides are really important, and I really hope I can get this across to you guys. This is much bigger than this trout that we're going to be studying in this particular presentation. climate change affects species of all levels, like I said. And so the first reason of why it matters is because species could become endangered or even extinct. These two pictures are really sad and dramatic pictures of dead fish just floating in the water. But this is actually happening in our world today, and it's very sad to see. But like we've kind of touched on for a second, trout are cold water species. So as the climate warms, then they might lose their habitat. And if they continue to lose habitat because of these things, then they could become endangered even to the point of extinction. So then, like I said, this is not just talking about trout. This is just fish in general on this slide, but there's many species that are affected by climate change, and it could endanger or make this species become extinct. And now at an even larger scale, climate change affects humans and human health. So we talked about how an increase in flow regime and an increase in temperature can make trout lose their habitat, and it damages the habitat for trout. But climate change is damaging our habitat as humans. On the left, I have a picture of a forest fire. And climate change has caused many damaging forest fires to happen, and that is affecting our habitat. And then on the right, we have a picture of what looks like a big storm coming. And climate change can also increase the frequency or the harshness of individual storm events. And so it's affecting our habitat, and it can even cause death to us because of these environmental conditions. Because if we get caught in a forest fire or in a really bad storm, it can damage our habitat or even kill us. And in the middle, we have a picture of a mosquito vector. And what a vector is an insect that carries a disease with them. And so as the climate warms, mosquitoes will kind of venture out past their normal habitat, reaching more humans. And mosquito vectors are really likely to carry diseases, especially upper respiratory diseases. And so if there is a highly contagious disease and the climate is warming, making mosquitoes venture out past their habitat, then it can increase the spread of diseases. So there's many different ways that climate change is damaging to human habitat and human health. So as we get into this whole study about trout and how trout are specifically affected by climate change, I just want you to keep in mind that this is on a much broader level. We're not just talking about this one fish species. This applies to many species and even humans. So this is just a really important topic in my opinion. Now let's get into the studies. Experimental study number 1 is by Mitro et al. And they studied the effects of climate change on brook and brown trout in Wisconsin. So here's just a picture of the state of Wisconsin, and there's kind of outlined of all of the stream reaches in there. So a little bit of background. Wisconsin has 21,000 kilometers of supportive stream reaches for trout when this study began. And what that means by supportive stream reaches is that it is cold enough and the flow is smooth enough to where it is suitable for trout. So supportive stream reaches is the same thing as saying suitable stream reaches. However, Wisconsin has been affected by climate change, just like we saw in the graphs that the United States has been affected. Since the 1950s, Wisconsin's climate has warmed. The nighttime low temperature has increased from 0.6 to 2.2 degrees Celsius, while the daytime high temperature has increased from 0.3 to 0.6 degrees Celsius. So these statistics show that climate change has affected Wisconsin. And so this study wants to see how much the climate change increase will specifically affect these trout. So let's get into what they're studying. They're studying 2 kinds of trout called brook trout and brown trout. And I've included pictures of each so that you have a reference and you can kind of picture what they're studying as we talk about the results of this. And they're studying the occurrence and habitat availability of these trout based on the changes in temperature and flow regime of these stream reaches caused by climate change. When is this being conducted? So they wanted to conduct this study on 2 time frames. One is which they called current, and that is from 1961 to 2000. And one is which they called future, which is 2046 to 2065. So they are going to use models, which we're going to get into in the next slide about the methods, but they're going to use models to study the current conditions and predict the future conditions and kind of compare the two and say, okay, here's how many stream reaches trout have in the current conditions. As the climate continues to warm and precipitation continues to increase, here's how much habitat will be suitable for trout in these current conditions. And so they're going to be comparing the two next to each other. And where will this be conducted? In all Wisconsin streams. So we're focusing just on the state of Wisconsin, and we're focusing on all stream reaches that trout have occupied. And here's another picture of the state of Wisconsin, and the blue represents all of the stream reaches. Now we're going to get into the methods. The methods are very complex, and it is highly technological models that are being used that were created by engineers, and they have a lot of math and data that go into them behind the scenes. Kind of like we input data into them, and then the computer will output the data that we need. And so obviously I have never worked with these models, and I'm sure many or most of you that are going to be watching this video have not worked with these models. So we're not going to completely understand all of the ins and outs, but I just want you guys to get a general overview of the models that they're using and the data that goes into it. So it's okay if we don't have a complete understanding of how they built the models and what all happens in the computer with all the technology, but I do want you guys to understand what data is going into it to extrapolate the data, and then what data is outputting to us for us to see. So this is FishViz. It is a very popular site used by ecologists, and this is what it would look like on a computer screen. So here's a map, and the green on the map represents habitat that trout would probably occupy, habitat that is suitable for trout, and the orange represents habitat that is not as suitable for trout. So like I said, this is just what it looks like, just to get a picture of that. And I have included it in this slide too, just so you can look at it while I'm explaining it more in detail. So what is FishViz and how does it work? FishViz is a web-based distribution model, meaning that we put data into it and it does its thing and predicts into the future for us. So it predicts the probability of occurrence of fish species, and in this study specifically trout, brook and brown trout. And it compiles information from multiple databases, and it puts all this data in there, and then it extrapolates it to allow us to visualize the differences in the species over time. And so what we're inputting is a bunch of data that is included in the next slide, but the output is the occurrence of fish species over time. And so we put in all this data about fish sample collections, environmental conditions, fish occurrence, and climate projections, and it extrapolates all the data to try to make a prediction. Like I said, this is just a prediction. Make a prediction of how will trout be affected by this in the future. So we have there is room for error, and there is room for a little bit of inaccuracy because this is just a prediction into the future. But we have a pretty good idea of this, because what they do is they say, okay, this is the fish data, the fish sample data collections for this stream, and this is how climate change has affected it so far. Like the flow regime in this stream is X, and the flow regime in this stream is X, and the temperature in this one and the temperature in this one is however. And then so we have all this data. Basically what I'm trying to say is we have all this data that we've been studying for years, and we understand how it has affected species thus far. And so we input that data into the system, and it will try to predict, okay, well, if it's increasing by this much in this stream reach in the future, then here's how it will affect trout then. So they include fish sample collections and all the data about the fish in the streams, and they include environmental characteristics. They include flow regime, they include temperature, they include how much shading the stream has, how much sediment it has, all of the abiotic conditions that will have an effect on these stream reaches, because it's not just, oh, well, the temperature increases by 2 degrees, so it's going to affect trout this much. There is abiotic variables that go into it that can potentially offset the amount of habitat that the trout loses. So then they use random forest models for fish occurrence, which is just an algorithm that shows how much fish will occur based on the abiotic conditions around, based on all of the things that ecologists know so far. And then all of that is put into the system along with what we call general circulation models, or GCMs, that will predict the climate change into the future, so that we have a general idea of how fish will be affected by this. And I included this picture because this just shows how many factors go into something. It's like I said, it's not just temperature, it's not just flow regime. Those are the main things that impact trout, but there is just so many things that go into it that will affect these species and that could offset the conditions. So what a general circulation model is, like I said, that's what they used for the climate projections. It is a model that simulates future conditions based on weather data inputs. And so here's a picture of just kind of like what that would look like. And it's built on a lot of physical principles and complex math to predict the matter and the energy. And then there's time steps that can go from minutes, hours, days, years. And it is based on grid size and depth. So again, there's all these factors that go into this model, and it is another highly technological model that has proven itself accurate in predicting the future weather conditions. And again, like I said, it is a prediction. There will be a little bit of room for error, but these ecologists just want to do everything that they can to make the most accurate predictions possible. So methods recap. This is the main thing I want you to take away of what the methods is. They use the data for the environmental characteristics, the abiotic variables, the data for the fish characteristics, how much fish are in the stream, and the characteristics that the fish need, including their critical thermal maximum, their reproductive strategies, just everything that they need to survive. They add that in with the random forest models that help predict the fish occurrence data based on their characteristics. And they add that also in with the general circulation models for the climate predictions. And that makes FishViz, which puts this all together, extrapolates the data, and then outputs for us the fish occurrence based on the data. So it's really cool. It's really interesting, very complex, but it's really interesting to me that they can put all this data in, and based on what we know so far, and we can get a fairly good idea of how this is going to affect fish into the future. And that's really important because we need to do everything we can to make sure that we are protecting these fish and protecting these species. And we can't do that if we don't know how they're going to be affected. So now let's get into how they're going to be affected with the results. So I just put together this little picture to show you the overall theme of the results. But the overall theme is that occurrence and habitat availability of trout decreased over time. So like I said, the current conditions were 1961 to 2000, and the future conditions were in the upper 2046 to 2065. So in the current conditions, there were a lot more brook and brown trout than in the future conditions, and there was a lot more suitable habitat for them in the current conditions also. As the climate continued to warm, a lot of these stream reaches became unsuitable for trout. So now let's get into brook trout specifically. So in the current conditions, there were 34,000 stream kilometers in Wisconsin that were suitable for trout, meaning that it had the correct critical thermal maxima and flow regime that trout could survive in. 34,000 kilometers for that. And then in the future conditions, it went down to only 11,000 kilometers that would be suitable for trout. So as a percentage, brook trout lost 68% of their habitat from the current to the future conditions. Now, and in this graph, like I said a second ago, the green represents high occurrence of trout and the orange represents low occurrence. So I gave you the numbers, but just by looking at this graph, you can see that there's a lot more green in the first graph and more orange in the second graph, meaning that over time, the trout lost probability of occurrence. Now for the brown trout. In current conditions, the brown trout had 20,000 kilometers of suitable habitat in Wisconsin, and in future conditions, it went down to 14,000 kilometers. So brown trout lost 32% of their habitat. And brown trout didn't lose as much as brook trout, but like I said, different trout species have different critical thermal maximas. They have different conditions. And so brown trout are actually adapted to a little bit warmer of temperatures than brook trout are. But as you can see, climate change was still very detrimental to brown trout. Like, even though they could withstand a little bit warmer conditions and they lost a little bit less habitat over these times, they were still very much negatively affected and lost a good bit of habitat in these climate change conditions. So overall, this is just another kind of overall picture of the results. And this is not in the this was not a figure from the paper. This was just one that I made to show the overall theme. But overall, the main thing to take away is as climate change increased, brook and brown trout occurrence and habitat decreased. Climate change increased the temperature and the flow regime, and it in turn made brook and brown trout lose habitat. Now, the second study is very similar to the first study in what they're studying. They just studied it in a different place with 2 more fish species. So this study was by Winger et al., and it was conducted in 2011, and it studied the effects of climate change on 4 trout species in the western United States. So over here to the right is just a figure from the study of the major stream reaches that they studied in this paper. And they studied cutthroat trout and rainbow trout along with the brook and brown trout. So they also studied the same trout that were studied in the first study, just along with 2 more. And again, here's just a picture of those for reference as we're talking about it. What did they study? Cutthroat, brook, brown, and rainbow trout. They studied the occurrence and habitat availability based on the temperature and flow regime changes from climate change. When did they study this? So like in the first study, how they compared it from current to future conditions, on this one, they also compared it to the current conditions. They have a graph where they have current based on these, but the main thing that they wanted to focus on was short-term to long-term conditions, and they defined short-term as the year 2040 and long-term as the year 2080. So they did more projections into the future at different time steps. And then where was this conducted? It was conducted in the inland western United States, and I've highlighted the states on this map that this study has taken place in. The methods, they used very similar methods as the first study. The only difference, and I'm going to go over them again just a little bit, but the only difference is that they used composite models that they specifically built for each trout species rather than using fish viz. So they still use the fish sample collections, the environmental characteristics, all the abiotic variables, and the climate projections, because all of these are necessities. But what they put that into was composite models for each of the species. And that means that they built models for each species based on the specific characteristics that gave them the most accurate outputs. So how were these composite models made? They used multi-level logistic regression models. And what that means is, I know that's a really big word, it's kind of confusing, but what that means in simple terms is that they inputted a lot of data, such as all those variables, the flow regime, the temperature, the oxygen levels, all of that, and it outputted the variable that they wanted, which was fish occurrence. But the reason that there was composite models, meaning the reason that the models are slightly different for each fish, is because they tested all these models multiple times to see which would give them the most accurate conditions with the least amount of variables. And what they figured was, or how they figured that out was, they put all these variables in, and then some of the variables were more accurate for different fish species. So for example, like they have different critical thermal maximums and they have different needs and characteristics. So the models were built, they were kind of specialized for each species. And all of these data went in for the specific fish, like different data would go in for rainbow trout and brook trout. And the models were made to be specialized for these trout to be as accurate as possible. Because like I said, we are predicting into the future. And so being as accurate as possible is definitely a goal of all these scientists. And what were the composite models used for? The same thing as fish viz, the same thing we've been studying is predicting the occurrence of the fish species over time based on the climate change. So another recap, they used the data for the fish characteristics, the data for the environmental characteristics, multi-level logistic regression models for the fish occurrence, and then the general circulation models again for the climate predictions. And that made the composite models, and they inputted all the data into the composite models. The composite models extrapolated the data and outputted the occurrence of these trout species over time based on the climate change. And like I said, they did it in 2040 and in 2080, but they wanted to do it under 3 different conditions in which they called PCM1, composite, and MURAC 3.2. So the composite model was the exact same thing that was studied in the first study, which was just typical climate change conditions. But then they also wanted to test less warming versus more warming and less precipitation versus more precipitation to kind of isolate temperature and precipitation to see which one had a greater effect on the trout over time. And so the PCM1 had less warming and more summer precipitation, while the Miroc had greater warming and less summer precipitation. So the greater warming model increased the temperature by about 5.5 degrees, while the less warming model increased the temperature by about 2.5 degrees. So first, we're just going to talk about the composite models, which was simply just the typical climate change conditions. And so what we're looking at in this graph is the white bar, which is the current conditions of each, versus the yellow bar and the brown bar, which is the yellow bar is the 2040s composite model and the brown bar is the 2080s composite model. And what we see is that through time, both in the 2040s and in the 2080s, every single trout species lost habitat due to climate change. So the cutthroat trout lost 28% by 2040 and 58% by 2080. The brook trout lost 44% by 2040 and 77% by 2080. The brown trout lost 16% by 2040 and 48% by 2080. And the rainbow trout probably adapted to a little bit higher temperatures, lost less habitat, but was still very much affected, lost 13% in the 2040s and 35% in the 2080s. So this figure shows exactly what I just said about the statistics that I read off about them losing habitat, but it's just kind of a different way to show it. It shows it on a map. So across the rows on the top, or like for the columns going down, we have cutthroat trout, brook trout, rainbow trout, and then brown trout. And on the rows going across, we have current conditions, 2040s, and then 2080s. And the gray shows habitat that is not suitable for trout, and the black shows habitat that is suitable for trout. So as you can see, shown by these figures, as time goes on, as you go down each level, there is less black and more gray, meaning as climate change continues to increase, there's less suitable habitat for each of these trout species. Now I want to talk about the Miroc versus the PCM1, the less warming and more precipitation versus the more warming and less precipitation. The 2080 Miroc, which was greater warming and less precipitation, had a greater decline on every trout species when the study was all said and done in 2080 than the PCM1. So what that means is that over time, greater warming had more of a negative effect on these trout species than greater precipitation. With the greater precipitation and the less warming, they actually had more habitat than in the composite models, than in the typical climate change conditions. So that shows that temperature increase is more detrimental to trout than precipitation increase. And then this is just another overview slide that I made. The main general theme is that as climate change increases, the occurrence and habitat of every single trout species decreased. But then what I want to show you is the differences in the different conditions. And like I said, this is just a model that I made just to show you an overall theme. It's not a perfectly accurate graph. But based on the data, as climate change increased, the typical climate change, which is the black arrow, decreased at a steady rate. But then the orange arrow, which is less warming and more precipitation, it also decreased, but at a much slower rate. While the more warming and less precipitation modeled by the blue arrow, it decreased at an extremely faster rate than both of the other two. So under any climate change condition, trout lost habitat in this study, but the most detrimental conditions for trout was in the more warming and less precipitation conditions. The conclusion of both of the studies in this entire study is that the results support the hypothesis in that as climate change increases, all these trout species will lose habitat and become and will have less occurrence. And overall, it just shows that climate change is detrimental for trout species. Lastly, I'm going to go through the take-home message, and every point is just going to get a little bit broader just for us to think about how this really affects things at a large scale. So the first thing is what we looked at in this study. Climate change decreases occurrence in trout habitat. Climate change is very detrimental to trout. Both of these studies support that. I'm sure there's many other studies that support that. I know there's many more that I looked at that support that. And next, climate change can be detrimental for all cold water species and species with the same reproductive traits as trout. So we saw that those two things about trout, them having the reproductive strategies that they do, and them being ectothermic and cold water species, those were the two things that made them vulnerable to climate change. And so species such as other fish or just any other species that share these traits with trout will make them vulnerable to climate change also. So not only can climate change be detrimental to trout, but it can also be detrimental to species that are similar to trout. And lastly, climate change brings challenges for survival for humans and wildlife. Like we talked about earlier, climate change can be detrimental for life at all scales. And so this is not just about trout. There is probably study after study after study that we could read about how climate change is detrimental for all these different species and even for us as humans. And so that's just the major takeaway, is that climate change is important. We should educate ourselves about it and we should be aware. Now, these are my references. I hope you guys enjoyed this study. I hope you learned a lot about climate change and trout, and I hope it encourages you to educate yourself more on climate change and maybe take action and to start movements and just to see what we can do as humans to potentially offset the effects of climate change. Thank you.